Hello lovely people, welcome to my autumn reading wrap-up part 1.
I
thought it would be fun to do sort of a midpoint check-in. What have I read so far from my autumn TBR? And then if you're interested in what's to come, I will post my TBR video down below and you can see what I'll be summing up in the next one of these in a few weeks' time. But I just thought, let's do a little check-in. What have I read so far? The first book that I read is Remarkable Creatures by Tracy Chevalier, which tells the story of Mary Anning. Discovered a lot of dinosaur skeletons in Lyme Regis just when fossil hunting was taking off. She was heavily influential, but she was initially largely ignored, her contributions weren't recognised. It also tells the story of Elizabeth Philpott. I knew that this was Mary Anning. I didn't realise there was also another narrative focus, which was Elizabeth Philpott, who was very interested in fossilised fish and stuff like that. I buddy read this with Olive at a Book Olive, and I was really excited to. I've never really done a buddy read before, and I was like, how exciting. Unfortunately, this was one of those books where I didn't hate this book, but I also found myself, I just don't really have a lot to say about it, I think. I thought it was absolutely fine. It really made me want to read a non-fiction book about Mary Anning and Elizabeth Philpott, because one of the things I found was I wanted to know how much of this was true and how much of this was narrative invention that you kind of have to do sometimes when you're doing historical fiction. And I actually, this is going to sound really harsh, I found reading the Wikipedia article slightly more interesting than I actually found reading this, because the Wikipedia article gave me loads more information on them. Elizabeth Philpott invented this way of painting using fossilized things and stuff like that, which is so interesting and it's never mentioned in this book, and I kind of want to learn more about that and stuff like that. So this was one of those books where I perfectly enjoyed reading it. I equally kind of could have put it down and never picked it back up again, and I'm kind of a bit sad that I didn't love it, because it's one of those things where if you were to list it off to me, it has lots of things which are buzzwords that I like, but just something about it, there wasn't really a spark for me upon reading it. There were things I found interesting. I really enjoyed the look at when fossils were being discovered, and how that was challenging to ideas of faith and stuff that were held. So there are a number of different people who give their opinions on how these fossils can coexist with the idea of the Christian creation of the world that was popularly held. There are some people who took the God made the world in 7 days incredibly literally and think it happened in 7 days, and therefore these fossilized remains of things is really baffling, because God wouldn't have made any mistakes, this can't be real. There are other people who took that 7 days to be a bit metaphorical, 7 ages. So God went through 7 ages of creation, and in one of those ages of creation there may well have been these beasts, and then blah blah blah, God's greatest creation is humans. Therefore, it doesn't matter that there are these creatures which obviously are not still alive, and extinction and that sort of stuff, because it still fits with God's aim. All of these things, you get a number of different characters' perspectives on what do these fossils mean? What do these fossils mean to faith? What do these fossils mean to scientific understanding? Stuff like that. That was interesting. Another thing I found interesting is, right at the very start of this, there is a really wonderful passage which is narrated by Elizabeth Philpott, which is about how people lead with certain features. So, Mary Anning led with her eyes, and that's why she was so captivating, and one of this Elizabeth's sisters leads with her hands, and that sort of thing. I really enjoyed that, and that's why I was really excited, I think, when I first started this, because it started with that concept, and I was like, oh, fabulous. And then it was just fine, and we didn't really have any more of those sparkly moments that made me be like, oh, wonderful. I think I, right at the end, settled into it a little bit more. I don't know, I just, when you're I was disappointed that I didn't love it, and I don't really know why I didn't love it, there was just no spark for me. However, I am going to go forward and hopefully get my hands on some non-fiction about Mary Anning, which would be really cool, and Elizabeth Philpott, so there's that to take from it. Speaking of non-fiction, the next book that I finished was This Golden Fleece, A Journey Through Britain's Knitted History by Esther Rutter. This is what it kind of says on the tin, a journey through Britain's knitted history. Esther Rutter took 1 year, and she spent that year travelling around Britain, and every month she set herself a new garment to make. So each chapter is split into the garment that she's making, and when she's making this garment, she is telling you about the history of this garment, like how it came to be, and then by doing that is showing you Britain's relationship with wool across time. And the ways that it will defined communities, but then equally the way that like more modern industrial practices have sort of taken that away, those sorts of things. And as well as that, she's traveling around Britain, so she's talking to a lot of people and looking at like wool now. Like there's a whole chapter in this, which is all about like craftivism, so like crafting activism and stuff like that. So that's very like and contemporary based, like with a lot of these protest movements and stuff that are happening now, and as well as that, it's also part biography of this year and her life, because as this year goes on, she discovers that she's pregnant, so she ends up knitting something for her baby, that sort of thing. This was thoroughly lovely, and I had a really fun time with it. I really like looking at social history, and I really like looking at social history like in different places and times and that sort of stuff. So she makes like a Gansey, so she looks at this relationship between like the sea and knitting. She looks at like the relationship between like Viking communities and wool. She looks at all of these things across all of these different times, and I thought it was really fab. Sometimes these types of books work better for me than others, and this is one that definitely really worked for me. Like a comparative point would be A Honeybee Heart Has Five Valves by Helen Jukes, which was a similar thing where it's like natural history, that was history of bees, mixed in with her personal life. But I felt like Helen Jukes' personal life had a bit too much focus. I don't know. I didn't enjoy the aspects of that were more about Helen Jukes' life, mainly because she was in this like liminal state of uncertainty, whereas mainly this was focused on the actual like information, like history side of it, with just like a little peppering of her life throughout that influences, like she makes the Gansey for her dad because he works outside a lot. She makes the baby blanket for her baby because she's discovered she's pregnant. That sort of thing worked a little bit better for me in this. It felt a little bit more like cohesive, I think, as a whole. But yes, I really enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun. After that, I read a book which has given me a lot to think about, and I had a really fun time. I read The Secrets of Jin Shay by Alma Alexander. This is Matt at NCS's favourite book. I know that Miriam at Between Lines and Life also loves it because I sent them both many messages as I was reading this. I had a really fun time reading this. This is, I thought that this was historical fiction. It's actually fantasy. It's a fantasy world that is heavily based on medieval China. It's not actually set in medieval China. Jin-Shei is this, like, bond that would, like, sort of translate to sisterhood, but it's like a chosen family thing. You choose your Jin-Shei sisters, but then you have, as well as all the support and love that comes with that, there's also, like, this element of, like, obligation and stuff like this. This follows 8 to 10 women who come from completely different backgrounds, all the way up to an empress, and it looks at these bonds, and then we sort of we go from there. There were a lot of twists and turns in this book, which I really enjoyed. I initially really enjoyed this book because I really enjoyed settling into the world. There are very luscious descriptions. It all felt very like vivid to me. I really enjoyed picturing these places we were at and that sort of thing. And I enjoyed the characters. All the characters, like 8 to 10 main characters is quite a lot. They did all feel very distinct to me. Like they all had their own motivations and skills and that sort of thing. So each time the Jin-Shei bond was entered into, it was entered into for different motivations and for different reasoning, and then seeing all of those things come together and then the way they played out and influenced everything was really interesting, and I loved like immersing myself in these characters in this world and this sisterhood. There were a lot of twists and turns that kept me on my toes. There were a bunch of things that happened that I was like, what is happening right now, my dudes? Which was really fun. I liked, like, sort of, there were things that you could see and you were like, okay, I see that this is going to become, like, an element and a thing. And then you'd just be like, twist! Extra piece of information! And I really enjoyed that. I think, especially having read this after being disappointed by Remarkable Creatures somewhat, this was kind of like the perfect thing for me to read because I really got sucked in and I got really absorbed. There is so much you could unpack in this. And maybe one day I'll do like a standalone video that's like my thoughts on some more spoilery content, because I'm still sitting with so much, I'm still sitting with so many like implications and stuff like that. If I have any critiques for this, I have two. If I have any, she has two. Number one is one of the characters in this is physically disabled and she has mobility issues, and the word that is used to refer to her all the time, I'm not going to say it because many disabled people view it as a slur. It begins with C. It's not a great word to use. I recognise that this was published in like 2003, 2004. Maybe conversations about this word were not quite so prevalent, etc. That was just a thing that I wanted to give some heads up about because it wasn't a great word choice to be using quite so frequently. My other thing is a thing that I've been sitting with that is not necessarily a criticism. There were a few plot threads which, towards the end, there were so many plot threads going on, and I loved a lot of them. There was like one, and I can't talk about it because it's a spoiler. There was one that I felt like got wrapped up very, very quickly, and at the time of reading it, I was a little bit like, oh, is that it? I thought there would be more there. But then the more I think about it, I think it's kind of supposed to be like that. Because there is a figure that I expected the downfall of to be much more of like a momentous occasion, but actually it was like one aspect of a much larger crescendo moment that sort of happened. And I kind of think that really what was going on there was like, it was showing me that this person who I view as a big bad that needs taking down, maybe the point is not that everything is so clear cut as like good bad, although this person is a little shit. It's more, let's look at our Jin-Shei sisterhood and let's look at the actions that they have proceeded with, because some of them approach this Jin-Shei bond in a slightly more like, what can I get out of this, / using it in ways to make people do things that they might not necessarily actually want to do. And there was an interesting look at like paralleling these people, so like this person that I view as a big bad, but then these other people that I really like because I've gone through this journey with them, but they've done objectively bad things now. About this idea of choice and this idea that like maybe this big bad person didn't actually set out to be absolutely terrible, but like these characters that I love makes these decisions that are bad decisions that lead to these things. I don't know, I felt like there was maybe a point being made about choice and about the small decisions we make that then lead into these big decisions which then affect people around us and have these terrible outcomes that we don't want, but that are outcomes of our actions. So that aspect I'm not sure if I actually am critical of now, because I wonder if the point was to make me consider these other things. I'm going to link to Matt's videos down below because he goes into it in a lot more depth and he discusses some really interesting topics. Oh, I could do like a whole other thing about the concept of legacy within this, and legacy in regards to like presence of parental figures in some of these women's lives, because I feel like the absence of parental figures has such an impact on this, especially this book which is about sisterhood. Actually, when you look at it, like the concept of parents is so complicated in this, and parents' legacies, and like lineage has so much to play out in this, like people's lineages become so important. All these sorts of things. I have so many thoughts. I'll probably do a standalone video at some point where we can be like, let's discuss this with some more spoilers. I didn't want to spoil anything in this video, but suffice to say, it was kind of like this really lovely world that I really enjoyed immersing myself into, and I'm really glad that I read it, and I had a lovely, lovely time. After that, I knew that I needed to read something that was like a completely different genre, because that was so immersive. I had a little bit of a book hangover, and I was like, what can I read now? I decided to pick up a book on my Kindle, and I read An Heir to Murder by Charles Heathcote, who you may know from Booktube. I'll leave a link to his channel down below. This was everything that I wanted it to be. I wanted like a cozy murder mystery that was also like a bit funny, and it was an absolute delight. I had such a good time. The concept of this is that Alice inherits this little cottage after her aunt dies, and essentially like a murder happens, which may tie into something that happened many years ago, and Alice ends up teaming up with this guy called Marmaduke. They kind of set out to like figure out what's going on, help solve this murder, that sort of thing. This was like, if I have comparative points for this, it reminded me a lot of Agatha Raisin series, MC Beaton, that's who the author is, brain of a sieve. Also Jodi Taylor's series, I think it's called Frog Martin series. It's not her main, I'll write the name down below, I can't remember it. Both like these cozy murder mysteries that actually have like a lot of humour at their heart. It was very witty while also being like that perfect little like cozy little town. So some might call it gossip, but actually it's like all of this information that you only know if you've spent a lot of time in this town and you know the people and you know like the histories of people, and that sort of thing becomes really important as the story goes on. It's like that perfect thing for me when it's like the weather is changing. I want to settle into a mystery, but I also want to have like a really fun, delightful time. And I did, and it was great. After that, I read With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo. Don't know why I lost my ability to say the word Elizabeth then. I absolutely loved this book. It was everything I wanted it to be. This one is Emily. She's 17, she has a 2-year-old daughter, she lives with her abuela, and essentially, like, she wants to be a chef, but equally she also has to juggle all these things that are going on in her life. So essentially, like, at school, this opportunity comes up to do this culinary course, which is challenging, and it challenges her. And I really enjoyed that aspect because Emily is someone who instinctively knows food, and she knows how to cook just by like, as she knows how to breathe, she knows how to cook. I love seeing the way that this course challenged her, not just to innately know food, but to then be like, okay, well, if you want to make it as a chef, what else do you need to know? You know, and I don't know, like that process, that journey she went on, she works bloody hard, and I really like enjoyed watching her grow. There's also sort of like a romance aspect of this, which I wasn't like hugely attached to, but I also did enjoy. One thing I liked about it is that the relationship happens like on Emily's terms. She's had this past experience with the father of her child whereby, you know, in many ways she's not been treated as well as she should have been treated. And one thing I liked about this sort of like new potential romance aspect in this book was that like Emily got to set boundaries, and she got to be saying, I'm comfortable doing this, I'm not comfortable doing that, and that was something that was respected. And I thought that that was so good. Like, I think that's so important to show in YA books, like people who are setting boundaries and having that really be respected and not something that's challenged from the romantic partner. That was wonderful. The oh god, the family, I loved like Emily's little family unit, like her abuela, her daughter Emma. This book, for like halfway through, I was like, this is a solid 4-star book for me. I'm having a really fun time, but it's not like gripped my soul. And then, like, by the end of it, I was like, oh wait, no, my soul is gripped. And I just really loved what this book was. It made me want to cook everything. I have been cooking things. I did a 2 Greedy Italians night the other day, and I cooked a bunch of recipes from 2 Greedy Italians. I'm doing some other stuff. I've got stuff planned, and I just, like, the love of food that ran throughout this was absolutely gorgeous, and it was so wonderful. The family dynamics, the bonds, everyone in this felt very real to me. I think that's what I'm feeling, is when I finished this, I felt very rooted in the characters, and I felt like I understood why characters acted the way they did, and that sort of thing. Like, people felt real to me, though I got really swept in, and I had a really good time, and I gave it 5 stars. Hey, different day, same Sophie. Let's carry on. The next book I want to talk about is Rebecca's Tale by Sally Beauman. This was a second attempt for me. I had previously tried to read this earlier this year, immediately after finishing Rebecca, because I thought it would be a good idea to read it while Rebecca was fresh in my mind. And that was the wrong idea, because Rebecca's one of my favourites. I've reread it a number of times, and I think I was so, Rebecca was so fresh in my mind that all I could focus on when I was reading this was what this wasn't, rather than what it was. So this time around, I had a much better time reading it, and I had a really fun time. I don't rate it as highly as Rebecca, but I was never expecting to. This is sort of Sally Beauman kind of writing back against Rebecca in some ways. So it's set 20 years after Rebecca ends. There are different narrative points of view of this, and I will say, I think another stumbling block I had the first time around is that I found the first narrative voice, Colonel Julian, I found him the one I enjoyed the least, partly because one thing that this does, which Rebecca also does, is you have like an unreliable narrator, which is so often the case when you have like first-person narratives, because, you know, everything you're getting is filtered through that person, therefore you're always getting a slightly biased view. And I think that this book very consciously plays with that, because essentially this guy, Terence Gray, has come to the Greater Mandalay area, and is trying to find out about Rebecca's past. Like, who was Rebecca before she married Max de Winter? And that means that then you get, it starts off with Colonel Julian's perspective, and then you get Terence Grey, and then different perspectives as you go through. And so each time you have a different perspective, you're having a different person's approach to the figure of Rebecca, which in some ways I think was a really fun way to sort of play around with how many different interpretations of Rebecca you can get when you read Rebecca, because you can take the narrator of Rebecca's view as fact of who Rebecca was, even though she never met her. You can take Maxim's view of Rebecca that he tells the narrator as fact, in which case you'd have a very particular view of Rebecca. And then there are other people in the narrative who you get their view, like Mrs. Danvers, those things. So, like, I feel like this is very consciously engaging with that fact of Rebecca as an elusive figure who both has so much presence in her absence, and so there's this combination of, we know so much about Rebecca because she imbues that original text, but equally we know nothing about her because we never meet her and we're getting everything secondhand. So this plays with that, and it plays with that through the different narratives as they try and investigate Rebecca. So Colonel Julian has a very particular view of Rebecca in his mind, and that was one of the things that rubbed me up the wrong way. At the time, I felt like Sally Beauman had changed the character of Rebecca to fit this narrative that she wanted to tell. Now, with hindsight, I recognise that actually what she was doing is she was showing us Colonel Julian's biased view and influenced by his life experiences and the interactions he's had with Rebecca. And then you have Terence Grey, who is investigating, and it takes a while for us to find out why he is so invested and so interested in finding out more about Rebecca. So then he has also come in with a bias, and he kind of is looking for certain things. There's another perspective in this, which is a woman's perspective, who I found particularly enjoyable because I saw Sally Beauman really engaging with a lot of feminist interpretations of the original Rebecca novel, which I studied Rebecca in my women's lit and feminist theory module. So I was familiar with some of these interpretations that you can have of Rebecca, and so then Ellie's narrative in this felt very consciously playing with those and very consciously pointing out the ways in which men in these books tend to view Rebecca and dichotomize her as either like virgin or whore type narratives. And then Ellie's perspective in this seemed to be giving a lot more of a nuanced kind of let's take Rebecca at her word rather than taking other people at their words. You'd also get a point of view that is Rebecca's point of view from some writings, and that was very interesting. I had a chat with my friend about this because she recommended this to me in the first place, about how this text portrays Rebecca, and one thing that we talked about was this text portrays Rebecca as much younger than we had imagined her. There's a line in the original Rebecca book where the narrator says something about how she wants to be like, she wishes she was 30 wearing black satin and pearls or something, and then Maxim is like, you wouldn't be here if you were that. And how we both sort of interpreted that to mean that that was Rebecca, that was our narrator's idea of Rebecca. So we'd always considered Rebecca to be the same age as Maxim, because in many ways one of the things that the narrator in Rebecca struggles with is not feeling like an equal with Maxim, whereas she views like Rebecca was Maxim's equal in every way and that sort of thing. So Rebecca was much younger in this. I don't know, this is one of those books where I actually got really hooked in the end, and I sped through it and I had a really fun time reading it. Occasionally I sat there and I was like, I wish I knew what motivated Sally Beauman to write this, because whilst she answers a lot of the questions that she herself poses, she also retains a lot of that ambiguity. So I was like, I wonder what her motivation was. Like, did she just want to write back against Rebecca and that sort of thing, and give her a bit of a voice and explore that? I don't know, mainly just because of that, there are answers to questions, but equally there is so much that is also left unanswered, that I was like, what did she hope to achieve? And I don't mean that to sound like I'm saying that she achieved nothing, because I think she did. I was just like, I would be so interested to know what drew her to this, to doing this. I don't know. It's a bit of a chunky one, but the text is quite big, and it does pick up pace quite a lot. I do know that this is a very divisive book based on the Goodreads reviews. It seems that people either love it or hate it. I kind of fell somewhere in between, where I ended up having a fun time reading it, and I do think that there is a lot of fun that's being had with playing around with the original Rebecca. I think it is important to recognise that this is, like, my friend described it as, she kind of viewed it as just like a work of fan fiction about Rebecca. Like, it's not supposed to rewrite Rebecca, it's just like, let's explore what if this was the case, which I think is a beneficial way of approaching this text, because I think there's always a thing that comes around when you're reading sequels that were not written by the original author, and that's why I wonder what prompted Sally Beaumont to write this, because, you know, I don't know, there's something interesting when it comes to writing it back against other people's work, and writing back can be something that's very powerful, and it can be something that gives voice to people who in the original narrative were sidelined and didn't have voices, like, for example, Wide Sargasso Sea, which is writing back against Jane Eyre, and it's giving Bertha a voice, and stuff like that. Like, you can do really powerful things when you write back against texts, and I kind of feel intrigued by what drove Sally Beaumont to write this, and I had a fun time. I gave it 3 stars. Maybe, did I feel like talking about it now? I may be reassessing, I don't know, but I had a fun time and I enjoyed it, and I definitely am glad that I gave it a second chance, and I think it was good to give it a second chance with some space from the original text. The next book I read was on my Kindle. I read An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir, which is the first book in a fantasy series that is inspired by ancient Rome. We follow Laia, who is part of the Scholar people. The Scholar people are essentially enslaved and oppressed by the Empire. And then the other perspective is Elias, who is a soldier within this empire, and you see the ways in which, equally, just because he is like an official citizen of this empire, there are still like deep brutality, etc. This book was like relentlessly action-packed, and I had a cracking time reading it. It was one of those books where, like, from the get-go, you were like straight into action. Initially, I found myself ever so slightly detached, only because we were like into the action, but I was still getting to know the characters. But one thing I think this text did so well is it, like, by the end, I really understood both Laia and Elias, and I really understood, like, their strengths, their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities, like, what motivates them. So yeah, I felt like, although initially I was like, I'm just going to go with it, and I'm really glad I just went with it, because I ended up feeling like I really understood these characters and I understood their motivations. And I did really enjoy how just action-packed and fast this text was. I will say that this is also a book that does not shy away from dealing with, like, some really intense, brutal stuff. Like, the Empire is brutal, and you really see that. You see that through their actions. And there were a number of moments in this where I was like, oh god, I see what's about to happen, and it tears me, it tears at me. I just thought this was like a really fun, exciting fantasy series, and I said that I like immersing myself, like, autumn makes me want to immerse myself in, like, an exciting fantasy world, and I feel like this did that really well, because I had some familiarity in regards to, like, I have studied, like, aspects of the Roman Empire, so having that as sort of like a backing, but then seeing the ways in which Sabaa Tahir has, like, you know, taken it as a base and then, like, created her own world on top of it. I just really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed this aspect of who do you trust, because there are characters in different people's perspectives who I really like, but throughout it all I was like, God, I want to be able to confidently say that you can trust this person with this information, but I honestly don't know. And I really liked that sort of, like, I always felt like I was kept on my toes. I was like, even when I could see things that might be about to happen, I was like, but I don't know how the X character is going to react to this. There are definitely some side characters that I am hoping will see a little bit more of, like Helene. I really found Helene very interesting. There was kind of like a romantic square going on. So I feel like I'm supposed to be rooting for, like, A and B, but I felt a little bit more invested in, like, A and C. I don't know. This is all very vague because I'm trying not to spoil it, but essentially, like, the romance is the aspect that I feel myself less invested in, but that is something that I just tend to experience when I read these types of books anyway. I really want to read the second book because it was left on we were left at a point where I was like, I need to know what's going to happen. There's a lot of, like, conflict of interests happening. I don't know. I found it really fun and really exciting, and I understand why Booktube has been raving about it and why it has such a high rating on Goodreads, and I definitely want to continue and read the second book, and I might even just go for it and buy the second book and read it and wrap it up in the second part of the autumn wrap-up. We'll see if I do that. The final book I'm going to talk about in this part 1 wrap-up is Dictatorland, The Men Who Stole Africa by Paul Kenyon. This was a hard read at times, but I'm really glad I've read it. So it's split into both commodities and countries. So part 1 is about gold and diamonds, and we look at Congo and Zimbabwe. Part 2 is about oil, which looks at Libya, Nigeria, and Equatorial Guinea. Part 3 is about chocolate, which looks at Côte d'Ivoire. And then part 4 is called like A Modern Slavery, which looks at Eritrea. This was super informative to me because one of the things I said is that I have been watching a couple of documentaries that have been part of the BBC's Focus on Africa recently, and I just became aware that I was like, there is so many African country histories which I have absolutely no idea about. So this was super informative. This is kind of looking at each section that is focused on a commodity includes a portion that is before the dictators. So it is kind of looking essentially at the colonialist history, and then it sort of does like an intro into like the colonialist history, and then looks at these countries gaining independence, but then also specifically is focused on dictators. So it is focused on countries who then had dictators who came into control and how they perpetuated control, and then equally how their control was linked to these things like oil and diamonds and chocolate and that sort of thing. This was immensely educational for me. I really did appreciate having a before the dictators section that did actually look at like how it's essentially like, you know, countries like the UK, like America, like Belgium, like France, that through them like essentially exploiting these countries for these resources, and then the ways in which they all had like a similar narrative thing, and I don't have enough knowledge of history to know if this like reading is like accurate and correct, but a lot of them it's like these dictators gained control for very valid reasons because it was like their countries are being exploited by colonialist powers. It's just that then they themselves, in order to retain control, became increasingly corrupt and created these states of, you know, like absolute corruption and stuff like this. Like Eritrea was incredibly educational for me because, to be honest with you, I didn't know anything about that. Whereas some of these other focuses on people like, you know, like Gaddafi and stuff like that, like I had like a vague semblance of knowledge, but Eritrea was one that was particularly informative, as was Côte d'Ivoire, because all of these resources, like, I don't buy diamonds, I don't control, like, oil, that sort of thing, but I can control my chocolate consumption, and I hadn't quite realised the extent to which, just like, essentially, because chocolate needs very, very specific growing conditions, there is like a strip along various African countries where they are like the main chocolate suppliers, even though it's not a plant that is native to Africa. There's like a particular belt which has the perfect conditions to grow it in, and it's a process that cannot be mechanized. They've tried, it fails. So essentially this looked at the before the dictators aspect, looked at like back when chocolate was becoming popular, and these people like, for example, like Cadbury's and Fry's, which are Quaker families, and they had this whole drive in the UK where they built places like Bourneville, which are these like model villages, and they're all about improving the lives of their workers. But then you look at the conditions in which the chocolate is grown, and it's people forced into essentially a form of slavery where they are taken from their homes and they're taken to these places and they're supposed to be on like 5-year contracts, but then they just never end up being able to go home and they're just forced to work. And it was all very illuminating, and that's just like the chocolate chapter, let alone like Eritrea and all of these other things, and the aspect to which certain governments are quite so complicit in a lot of these exploitations and like supporting these regimes, and also it was very educational. One thing I actually kind of wish that there was a little bit more that examined like the impact of sort of like whichever colonialist government we're talking about on these things, because there was like the before the dictators bit, and then there was like talking about the dictators and how they maintained power and the corruption and how they exploited the funds generated by these resources and stuff like that, which is all very, very interesting, very, very educational, something that I didn't know about. But every now and then it would be like, oh yeah, but then like the CIA was really involved in like helping support this guy's regime, and I was like, I would like to know a little bit more about that, you know? Yes, this is not a book that is an easy read because, for example, there is a lot of detail given in the ways in which people are detained in prisons and tortured and coups, and there was a lot that was given in quite some detail about a lot of the brutality that a lot of the citizens of these places have experienced. So I would give like a heavy little trigger warning there, like go in expecting to read some quite harrowing descriptions of what people have been through, but I do think that I really appreciate now knowing this information, and if nothing else, the one thing I will take from this, I'm definitely going to change my chocolate purchasing habit. For example, one way in which I can do this, Tony's Chocolonely as a brand is a brand that is committed to being 100% slave-free chocolate, which should not be a unique selling point, but kind of is. Also, in addition, like fair trade stuff that is certified, that workers are working in good conditions and receiving financial compensation and stuff like that. The amount of buffer that big chocolate companies like Cadbury, like Nestle, have created in order to distance themselves from responsibility, I think is incredibly suspect. One thing that was really interesting was that before the dictator section talked about how even the Quaker version of Cadbury's, like, between receiving the information that maybe there is slavery involved in harvesting cocoa and actually acting on that, 8 years, and that's a long time. I'll definitely be changing my purchasing habits there. It's a small thing, but it is a thing that I can do because I don't really feel like I can do any of the other things that are related to this. But suffice to say, a very good read, very informative. I'm not just going to stop here. I would like to continue reading more books that inform my knowledge of Africa as a continent and then individual countries within that continent. But yeah, very informative, a very good non-fiction read, I would say. That's everything I want to talk about in this part 1. I will be continuing with my TBR. I will link that down below if you have an interest in what sort of books might be picking up in the part 2 wrap-up of this. I'm hoping to post my part 2 at the end of October, so that will be a sum-up of all of the autumnal reads that I've read in this coming month. But yeah, that's it. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of these. I thought that by breaking it into 2, I might stop it being from quite such a mammoth thing, but I realised that I've just talked a whole lot, so that might be wrong. But yeah, I'm always interested to hear people's thoughts on any of these things, or anything that's related to these things. Do feel free to have a chat in the comments down below. But otherwise, I will see you next time for something different.